All right, so let's get into policies. Now, we know from a previous module that we have labels, and the labels come from a classification taxonomy that was created outside of Azure Information Protection. Those labels are the instantiation of those classifications. In addition to labels being part of a policy, there's also a number of different settings that make up a policy. And so those two components are pushed together and you've got a policy. And then that policy is now assigned to a user or a group. So that's essentially all a policy is. It's some labels and a bunch of different settings that are put together and then pushed out to a group or a user. Now let's talk a little bit more about those policies in depth. The first grouping of components in the policy are the common settings, the name, the description. So that's the first thing that you're going to need to fill out when you create a new policy. The next thing is to select what groups and or users are going to get that policy. Then you have to select what labels should be included within that policy. And then finally, there's some additional settings below the labels that will override the contents of the global policy. So speaking of the global policy, this would probably be easier to understand if we just go to the portal and look at what's in the global policy and talk a little bit about those settings and how the global policy interacts with scope policies. All right, so we're in the Azure portal in the Azure Information Protection setting, and you see under classifications, I've selected policies, and we've got a few policies within there. The one that we're going to take a look at is the global policy. The global policy is a special policy, and it's created when the Azure Information Protection feature is turned on. There's different versions of the global policy, and I would refer to the Microsoft documentation to kind of see if you turned this on a while ago, what version of the global policy you have, but you can update it manually to the most current version of the global policy, or just edit it in a way that makes sense for your organization. So we do have the policy name, and we do have a description for the policy, but you'll see that the area where you would normally select users is grayed out, and that's because the global policy applies to all users within Azure Active Directory. So you don't assign it to a specific set of users or groups. Below that, we have the labels. And so these are the labels that will be included within the global policy, and everyone gets these labels regardless of what other policies are applied to them. Now, as we talked about in the labels section, you can have a label and then sublabels. Confidential is a good example of that. If we expand confidential, we'll see that there's 3 sublabels. Not all sublabels have to be part of the global policy. If I click on Add Remove Labels and scroll down a little bit, you can see that under Highly Confidential, there are 3 additional sublabels. These are not included in the global policy right now. If you wanted those sublabels to be included for a particular group, then you could do that within a scoped policy. Let's close that. Scroll down a little bit more, and here's the global settings that are going to be applied to users if they don't have another policy associated with them. So you can do things like select what's the default label for all new documents, determine whether or not a document needs to have a label, and determine if a user is trying to set a lower classification label or remove a label or remove protection. Are you going to prompt them for a business justification for doing so? You can also decide if an email message with attachments should get labeled, whether the information protection bar is displayed in Office apps, whether the Do Not Forward button is added to the Outlook ribbon, and if custom permissions should be available for users. The last thing at the bottom is a custom URL you can put in. If users are curious about the policy and want to know more, you can put in a custom URL they can go to that'll explain the company's policies around information protection a little bit more. So that's the global policy in a nutshell. Now let's go back to the presentation and we can look at policy application and how global policies interact with scoped policies.